Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about some common things that I see breaking on WordPress sites, usually after handover. So these are things that I've seen over 10, 15 years of, doing client websites, coming back to them afterwards as well. So I'm just going to run through what sort of things can actually break on WordPress websites, what sort of guardrails and frameworks can we maybe put in place to lessen that risk a little bit. So as developers, freelancers, designers, we do a lot when we're creating a website, specifically when we're gearing up to do launching the website. We do all the layouts, we do the content, we do SEO, we do performance monitoring, we do security, and we make sure that this thing is all worked on mobile and all the other devices. So we do an awful lot as developers up to handover to make sure the site is absolutely perfect. Then we get the client approval, we hand it over, and it's theirs, and everything is perfect in our sites. That's job done. We get paid, client's happy, we're happy, job done. Then real people start to use it. Okay. Quick show of hands, who has come back to a client site after maybe 6 months or a few months, and they've looked at it and went, what the hell is happening? I certainly have. Yeah. So most client websites don't just suddenly break. Some might do if you're running several plugins and upgrade to WordPress, but we won't talk about that. But most client sites devolve over time. Okay, so small changes here and there. None of this is malicious, of course. The client doesn't start out to want to break the website. But what we tend to find is the way that they use the website, the things that they do with the website, these small changes can be cumulative over a time, and it can end up to be costly for the client, have issues with the website over time. So things like urgent changes, maybe staff turnover, a new person's come in and they don't really understand how it works. For those, a new scope. So you might have spent ages a year ago, sit down with the client, understand what type of content they want to upload. But now the business has changed. Maybe they've got some different things. There's new types of content you hadn't really factored in when you were designing the system that they're trying to kind of squeeze into this new system. So the question for us isn't really, what can we do to stop that, because it's their website. They need to be able to do that. It's what can we put in place when we're designing the system to mitigate these kind of well-known issues when we hand it over to the client. So the client should be able to use the website. That's what we do for them. That's what we generate for them. That's how what they've paid us for. But the goal here isn't to lock everything down. Okay, so we're not generating a static site. We've still got a content management system. We want them to edit content, manage content. But at the same time, we want to make sure that website is still functional. It still works as they paid for. So it's really up to us to, as freelancers and designers, developers, agency owners, to decide what type of freedom the client can have and what is useful, what they need, and what type of constraints that we can put in place to stop some of these common things from happening. So it's a bit of a judgment here. And that's why I think us as humans are still valuable, because AI can't really do judgment. It just does. So the judgment part of us being owners and business people is what the kind of what the clients are kind of looking forward to and what they're paying us for at the moment. So good guardrails, I'm going to call them guardrails or frameworks that we put in place. It shouldn't stop the client from doing what they need to do, but it should mitigate that kind of risk factor as much as possible without completely closing off the entire system. Okay, so for every part of the client website, I think we should ask these 3 questions. So when we're thinking about designing the website, whether it's a blog archive or it's a WooCommerce shop or it's an LMS system, we should be asking these types of questions to the client before we even get involved in the design. So what do they need the freedom to change? What sort of content are they uploading? What are they trying to do with the system? What are they going to do with the system once we deliver it? Okay. What happens if they do something wrong? So what happens if they upload something wrong? What happens if they change the way that they do a particular process? What are the consequences of that? Does it mean the layout shifts a little bit? Okay. Does it mean a form breaks or an API breaks? Okay, so there's different risks, different consequences for what happens when something goes wrong. And what can we do to reduce that consequence? And again, that's going to be depending on what the consequence is. You know? So I've kind of encapsulated that with three things. So freedom, what the client needs to do, consequences for what happens if they try and do something that the system isn't built to handle, and what guardrails can we put into that place to kind of prevent that from happening or mitigate that risk. So the first place that I see this usually goes wrong is with user access. So here's a real world scenario. Just say the client says, can you give Sarah from marketing, she needs to update the news section, okay? And just think, maybe that's in Divi, or it could be in Bricks Builder, or it could be some blocks for those. The easy access for us, for a developer, for a freelancer is, okay, we're thinking, right, they need to be able to add controls and drag on widgets and change the stuff. Okay, well, that means I'll just give them admin access, so then they can do that, okay? And that's a kind of lazy way of doing it, because you know they'll be able to do that stuff, but you're giving them the highest access. So Sarah can now update the news section, she can publish news blog posts, but she can also now update plugins, remove plugins, delete users, add users, create more admin users. She can go into WordPress settings. So that kind of laziness from a design point of view has consequences for that. So a question, hands up if anyone's inherited a client website that all the users are admins. Yep, it's very, very common. It's a very lazy thing to do, but it's a quick way to do. And sometimes we're busy, sometimes developers and freelancers are busy. So the easiest option is sometimes the one, especially if we've got a client breathing down our neck. Sarah's got this thing, it needs to go out tomorrow because we're doing a marketing campaign. Right, okay, I'll just give her admin access. So she can do that stuff now. So what can we do to mitigate that? Well, we can think about what people need to do and just give them access based on that particular job. And this is where we do this kind of, we talk to the clients initially, we see who's going to be using the system, what are they going to be doing. I like to go for a minimal access first. So what's the least amount of access I can give someone that's going to be looking after, say, the marketing section of a website? They don't need to install plugins. They definitely shouldn't be installing plugins or creating users. What's the minimal amount I can give them? Can they get away with being a contributor? Can they get away with being an editor? That sort of stuff. So that's where I come at it. I don't assume that they've got access to everything. I ask and see, what do they need access to? So check who really needs editor access, who really needs the admin, but don't assume that just by giving them that access that that's the best way to constrain that particular system. Custom roles and capabilities as well. Yes, it can be a bit of a pain to go through all those and check them off for an individual user, but it's usually a safer way rather than just giving them full access. You just give them access to those little bits that they actually need to do. And we know that different systems, different design systems like Elementor, like Beaver or Divi, they come with their own set of access controls that allow people to do things like drag widgets or change particular parts of the visual interface. So by ignoring those capabilities, we're kind of doing ourselves a little bit of disservice and being a bit lazy just by giving them a higher admin access. But of course, even if we do lock these things down, there's still different ways that editors, even if we give them this controlled access, can still kind of mess things up. So here's another scenario. I love these types of websites. These are like the 1990s websites. This is a car sales guy, I think. Isn't it? Yeah, it's just crazy. So just say the client needs another section on a page, right? They're doing a marketing campaign. They've got an existing landing page, but they're doing another campaign, need to modify some things. But rather than come back to us, they decide to take it under their own skills. So they duplicate the section and they do a few tweaks. And they might change the content, of course, because it's different marketing campaign. They might change the background. They might increase the size of the heading a little bit to be more prominent. Maybe they're moving things around, so the padding and break things get changed. Maybe something on the page that they're trying to do doesn't really fit well on the mobile device, so they just hide that, and that's okay. And that's just what we call a small design change, just one small change. But if they're doing lots of marketing campaigns, that one small change every month, over 6 months, over 8 months, and now you've got a whole bunch of completely different single page, completely different design systems. So you spent ages creating this nice system that works and looks perfect, and then over 6 months they've come along and everything's just completely changed. Fonts are everywhere, different things, and it's just no longer a design system. It's just a collection of different weird bits. So it's not catastrophic, what they did initially, but those small changes accumulate into something that can look pretty disastrous over time. So again, this isn't anything against the page builders like Elementor or Divi. The same thing can happen even if you're using WordPress blocks, and it's all about the ability that people have to be able to change that design system, moving things a little bit, moving the fonts and changing the paddings and changing all that stuff. They still have that capability to kind of screw up that interface, even though we've locked down their actual capabilities to edit stuff and maybe not install plugins. They can still screw with the design as we created it, as they wanted initially. So the editing tool itself probably hasn't failed. It's just the system that we've designed is giving them more control than we really should want. So what can we do about that? So we can educate the client. And I do a lot of stuff when I do handovers. We go through design constraints and documentation. We actually show them how to build these things that they need to build. So we introduce things like, rather than allowing to choose any font size, rather than showing them on Elementor how they can change like the font size and the kerning and stuff, we tell them that to use the H1, H2, H3, and how to use those. So we're constraining what they can do. So we're not showing them how to increase the font size. We're saying use H1, H2, H3, H4. So heading levels and things like that. Padding. So rather than showing them how to change paddings, we tell them to just drag the components or use the blocks, and we create global padding and global styles. So they say, don't worry about it. So don't go and adjust things, just use the components as they are, the blocks as they are. Things like landing pages. So we call them cards, where you've got an image, the heading, subheading, call to action. So rather than getting to design a new card for each marketing campaign, we get them to use a template, or we build a template for them. So they can then just import that in, and the basic stuff is there, the padding's there, the font stuff. All they need to do is change content. And with some of the new stuff that's coming out, with not just the page builders, but with blocks as well, we can actually lock down patterns. We can lock structures in place to say, yes, there's an image on the right-hand side, header 1, header 2 button, and they can change the content, but they can't move those things around. They're locked in design. That's good design. That's really good. So it just allows them to change the content, but not actually build a whole new marketing page for themselves. So there's lots of things we can do, we can put in place to kind of constrain that risk of them breaking the whole design out. So things like global styles, templates, and patterns that are supported across page builders, reusable components as well. When I used to use Generate Press and Generate Blocks as a stack. Now they don't really have repeatable patterns, not like they do in the site editor. But what I do is I'd maintain like a set of global pages or global templates that they could just then copy from. So they're pulling stuff across. Rather than create all the things themselves, it just gives that bit of consistency for them. Client opens a page and sees a warning from the SEO plugin that the title's a bit wrong. Okay, so this is the whole thing about if you think when a client's using a website, it's not just WordPress settings, it's not just page builders, it's plugins as well. Okay, so I'm sure you've went into a WordPress website and there's been Yoast or SEO Press or Rank Math, and you're writing your content, and then suddenly it's come up with all these scores, these metrics, and you see some red, And you're like, oh, crap. You know, that's obviously wrong. So it says the key phrase isn't in the title, so you go and you change the title, okay, to have the key phrase. But now all your headings are a bit off, so you go and change your keywords and put them in headings. And now the score changes again, and you're like, oh, right, so I need to add more phrases into my content. And then it suggests that the keyword's are no longer in the URL, so you're playing around with the slug now, you're changing that. And before they know it, they've rewritten the entire content that was originally copyrighted and ranked and was ranking okay, just because they've seen something in the system that's telling them to do all this stuff. So just beware of the types of plugins you're installing and the way that the clients are going to react to all this information. So suddenly the page that was strategic now doesn't rank properly or for what it's meant to, because the client has the ability to go in and change stuff, and they're seeing these recommendations from plugins. So be very aware of plugins that you're installing, that they're also allowing people to change the design of the system, even if it's content. Not only are plugins dangerous in that way for changing the content themselves, but then if you think about someone who's got access to that, they can also change things like redirects. They can introduce schemas that could throw off the entire article completely. No index, canonical URLs, all that stuff's available within that within the editor, you know, to change all that stuff. So you have to be very, very careful as to what access you give people to these particular systems as well. There's a very common thing that I see is that all clients just go completely crazy when they see all these traffic light system, and then they go changing things around. It just makes things really, really bad. So what can we do? We can have a chat with the client, and we can ask them who owns this SEO stuff. What I tend to do is I tend to band it into two camps. So we talk to the client and say, well, there's editorial SEO. So that's your page copy, your headings, your titles and meta, that stuff. Yeah, that should stay within the content editors, the copywriters. And then there's technical SEO. That's how it displays to Google, how Google finds it, how it interprets, how it ranks it. Who looks after that stuff? Should that be us if we've got a maintenance agreement? Or should that maybe not be Bob from marketing that's just doing the copy? Maybe that should be the technical copywriter that they've got in the other department. Maybe they should look after things like slugs, URLs, redirects, and schema. So that's their job. But if you don't chat and that's not defined, then it's a bit of a free-for-all for any client that goes into there. Okay. So SEO control should follow responsibility, not kind of curiosity of changing stuff just because the plugin wants you to. Decides who owns these SEO decisions. Another scenario, and this is quite common as well, is that incoming leads suddenly dry up. Maybe they do some marketing campaigns that were quite successful, but then the last 3 months are not getting as many leads come in. Maybe someone's noticed that the inquiry form, no, that's nothing's been coming in from that at all. But the client's actually tested the form and they say it's working. And you can see that. And they point to the submissions and say, look, the submissions are there. So what's happening? But a successful form submission is only the start of the workflow. And this is one of the most common things I see in my clients, or people are coming to me, is that they look at the form, they test it, and it works on the front end, so nothing's broken. They have a look, they can see the form submission there, but yet still no leads are coming and nothing's happening. And that's because they're not testing the entire workflow. So the submission is just the very start of the workflow. You've got to think about things like, where was the email notification sent to? Was the mailbox full? The email that was going to Sarah in marketing, but now Sarah's left. She left 3 months ago and her mailbox is gone. Things like the WordPress web server should not really be trusted to send emails. It doesn't send them properly, so it gets caught up in spam somewhere. So there's lots of points of failure that can happen with forms. And forms are like the client's major breadwinner to come in. It gives them leads, it gives them opportunities, it gives them revenue. So you want to make sure that forms are working properly, and you want to try and minimize that kind of issue that could happen if they stop working. So emails themselves, please don't let WordPress handle those. They should always go through some sort of transactional email. I use Amazon SES, and I've set that for all my clients. What that gives you, it gives you transaction, it gives you log files as well. So it gives you something to look at if there is an issue. Otherwise, it's just kind of going to a big black hole, and you can't diagnose those issues. So a question I had here was, when you're talking to the clients, do you know who's responsible for monitoring forms and form submissions for your client websites? Do you actually know when you're talking to them? Yeah. So it's one thing to just build a system. It's another one to have somebody actually monitoring it. Okay. And even if the CEO or the person you're talking to, doing the website for, even if they know who's responsible for that, maybe it is Sarah in marketing or Bob in technical copywriting, do they actually know that it's their responsibility? Because I've had clients before that says, oh, that's fine, you know, Bob will handle that. But does Bob actually know he's handling that? Or just kind of it going into a big black hole? Very, very common. So some solutions we can put in place. Ask these questions specifically for when you're dealing with emails and forms. Did WordPress receive it? So we do look at form submissions. That's usually the first thing. If a form's broken or not working, we want to make sure that when it's submitted, that we can actually see that submission somewhere. Okay. Pretty much every form provider now allows you to save to a database so you can go in and have a look at the forms. That's just step one in the process. Step two is, did the mail provider deliver it? So did it actually leave that WordPress ecosphere? Did it go out somewhere? Okay, and you can only really get that if you're logging emails. So if you're using a proper email system, you go and have a look at the logs and see, did it leave the system? Okay, good, you can trace that. Did the right people actually receive it? So this is when you're building the system and you're testing it out. Don't just complete the form, have a look at the submission, and assume it's actually went somewhere. Okay, because there could be issues with your DMRC, your DKIM, all that DNS stuff. Actually go to the place it's meant to be delivered to and ask the person, did you receive that? Okay, so we're looking from the start to the end. Okay, really important. And finally, and we're talking about maybe notification, did someone act on that? So did they get an email that said, you know, this form has been submitted or there's an action to do here? Did they get something from the CRM that said that there was a new contact being added? So there's lots of different points we need to check through, especially when we're talking about forms. Last scenario, I think. So we're talking about design again. So you know how you spend ages with all the design, you make sure everything's nice and polished. For example, when you're doing the blog archive, you know, you spend ages making sure it's a landscape, you know, and that it all lines up with all the blog stuff and they're all cardy and they're all the same height. And that's fine. But then what happens when a client uploads an 8 GB square or portrait photo? Because that's what they have on their camera phone. Yeah. And that breaks the design. So we have a look at things like that as well. If you are designing a system like that, an interface, and you are assuming that the client is going to follow your rules that you've put in place to make that work, that's a huge failure point. That's a huge risk because they're not going to do that because they're clients. Okay, they're going to take their iPhone 17, they're going to take something in portrait mode, and they're going to upload a 12 GB, huge picture, and it's going to break everything. It's going to be slow. It's going to push things out everywhere. So suddenly the layout looks wrong. It looks weird. The client themselves didn't do anything unreasonable in their view. And this is the same issue for things like PDFs and other types of files that you're uploading. Always check that the stuff that they're uploading is within the design constraint, or you build the design in for them. Otherwise, they're just going to upload whatever they can, whatever's at hand. I call that content entropy. It's where you set this little design and it looks great for you, but then the client comes around with all this weird stuff and it just breaks everything. So instead of telling the client, upload a 16:9 image, and they're like, what does that mean? You build it into the system so it handles things gracefully. So rather than expecting a particular format, your design layout now adapts to whatever content could be uploaded. And that's a conversation you rewind, you have with the client at the beginning. So when you're saying, you're going to do, let's just say, a product archive, for example, and all the data you've been given are all nice landscape formats for those. But you want to have a conversation to say, what future products are you going to have? Is there ever an occasion where there might be a square, or it might be a portrait, or something a little bit different? Yeah. And then if it is, then you build that into your design. You build it flexible design. Maybe the layout doesn't need to be card. Maybe it should be masonry to adapt to, portrait or squares or things like that. So if we can design the system to match what the client's real world data is going to be, then that's going to be much more resilient, much more risk adverse to just design what we think it should work. So that goes for all different types of content. PDF files are a big one as well, uploading those and assuming that they're in the same format or whatever. Staff bios as well, staff come and go, headshots change. I've seen a beautiful headshot layout organization structure that I developed. Then someone uploads a 128 by 128 JPEG, and suddenly everything's kind of out of it. And it happens to be the new CEO, of course. So we want to make sure our systems adapt and we put constraints. And we can do that with things with blocks, even with components in Elementor and Divi, or advanced custom fields. We can say that it's got to be this particular dimension. We can link to help docs. We can link to screenshots that show them exactly what sort of stuff that we're expecting, and we can adapt to those. So a big question to ask is, who will actually be using this website in 6 months' time? So us as developers and designers shouldn't really be developing a website for handover. We should be developing a website that works at handover, at 6 months, even a year out, from a design and constraint point of view. And that might look different for different people. So I work with lots of different clients. It might be a tech-savvy single business owner, and they might be all right with admin access. They might understand not to install plugins and do all that stuff. And that might be an easy fix. It might be the best fix because they're going to look after WordPress. But then think about larger organizations that have multiple departments. They've got rotating staff as well, especially in departments that are got high content turnaround, like sales and marketing, that they're doing all these campaigns. You've got contractors that might come in. You've got guest posts as well. You might have volunteers if you're working with charities and organizations. And again, the multiple departments. So you've really got to think what's best for that particular client. What I'm trying to say is there's not a one fits all, or there shouldn't be. Don't just give admin access to everyone and assume that that's going to fix all the problems. But again, don't assume that restricting everything down is going to be the best thing for your client if they are like a techie person and they want to have a little bit more freedom. So it's a little bit of, our judgment to do that. So give the right amount of client freedom, but it's contextual. It's depending on who they are and what they need to do. So how do you actually apply all this without every project turning into like some sort of weird governance nightmare? Because you can get bogged down in bureaucracy. We don't want that. We want to be flexible, but still have some sort of constraints. So I run this type of system. It's a little bit more complicated, but this is the summary of it. I run this pretty much at every handover. Definitely if I'm onboarding new clients, if it's a maintenance client, or if I'm doing an audit, like a 5-minute audit for a company, just say someone's come to me and they said the website's looking weird. They had it designed 6 months ago, but now these things aren't working. This is my kind of 5-minute, 5-area thing that I will do a check for free and see what's happening. So access, that's the first thing I look at. That's why I started with that one tonight. Can they change something that they shouldn't need to? That's usually a 9 out of 10. That's the problem. You go again, you see everyone's admin. You're like, okay, well, you kind of know that they're tinkering around with things that they shouldn't. Editing. Can normal content changes damage the design? So we talked about people uploading like a square or a portrait picture into the blog archive or the shop archive. That's going to screw things up. So have a look at that area. Is that what's happening? Settings. Can one small change affect the whole site? And again, this kind of links in with access. What can people do? Can they change stuff in the SEO, in the settings on a post? Should they be able to do that? Can they go into settings reading and check that little hide my website from robots type thing, and then suddenly poof, the entire website is gone from Google, and it takes them another 8 months to get all that stuff back? Yeah. Even that one thing, and I've had that happen to many clients, somehow or someone at some point has checked that, and then they've come back and said, we're missing from Google. And I said, well, that's one checkbox, one thing that one person did at one time, and now it's like an 8-month slog to get all the stuff back. So small things can be big risks. Business functions. So we talked about the forms issue here. Look at the entire business function. Don't just assume that because one thing has happened or triggered from the website, that everything else that follows onto it is now working. Go and follow through all those. A lot of the clients that I work with have some sort of CRM or email marketing system. So when something happens on a form or a sign up or a call to action, then it goes off to an external system, which will then add them as a contact, put them on the list, tag them, which then sends out automations, which then people will click on, and when they click on that, then turns automations. All that stuff should be looked at from start to beginning. Don't just assume that because they filled something out or clicked a button, that whole thing works. And content. Have a think about what sort of content, have a discussion. Again, that can just be a 1 or 2 minute conversation. What stuff are you uploading? What are you uploading to your blogs? What new products are you going to be launching in the next 5-6 months? Does it actually break the system? The stuff that you're uploading, does it work within what you've got at the moment? Will it work in 5-6 months' time? So that only takes 5 minutes to ask them. You kind of come up with or have a look at the end system. You come up with a really good overview as to, is this thing broken or not? And where the particular areas of the issues are. Because it might not be all of them, it might just be one, or they could be straggling 2 or 3 different areas. Now, note, this isn't a full site audit. This is just like a tester to have a look. If any of these areas flag an issue, like if everyone's an admin or you figured out that the form's broken down the road somewhere, then that should be a paid audit. That should be a paid work. So don't be offering that for free. That is now serious business stuff that you need to actually investigate. So that should be paid work for that. But it starts to kind of tease out the deeper issues that are in the website. Now, you don't need to predict every possible mistake that could happen, because that's too much. But if we concentrate on these areas, we can get a pretty good idea about the risk and the issues that could happen on a client website. Now, if there's one thing I want you to remember tonight, or take away, it's to build websites that survive real people, real clients. This is from the WordCamp Sydney 2024. Some of our attendees dressed up as wapoos. But we build a website for clients to use. So they are going to change bits of the website. And that's the whole point of a content management system. So we don't want to lock it down too much. But people will make mistakes. They'll upload wrong things. They might not understand what they're uploading. So it's kind of our job to minimize that risk by putting really good design systems in place, really good documentation, flexible designs. Your job isn't to make the site impossible to break. It's just to minimize those big areas that could break, things like forms and site layouts. A good WordPress build isn't just one that works on launch day at handover. It's one that can work a month, 6 months after without breaking too much. That's it for today. You can connect with me. I'm mostly on LinkedIn. The QR code is a bit off the screen there. But if you look for me, Will Brown AU on LinkedIn, and connect with me. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to take some Q&A just now. There's a few prompts there to kick you off if you don't want, but